My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I am 42 years old. For 32 years, I have carried a secret so terrifying that it has consumed every moment of my existence. I am the only survivor of what the media called the Appalachian Disappearances, 97 children who vanished without a trace from our small mountain town between 1992 and 2022. I was 10 years old when I should have become victim number 38. Instead, I became the only witness to something so horrific that it defies human comprehension. For decades, I convinced myself that staying silent would protect others. I was wrong. The disappearances have begun again, and this time, I cannot remain quiet. What I am about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about reality. The mountains of Appalachia hold secrets older than human civilization, and my hometown of Millbrook became feeding ground for something that should have remained buried in the deepest caverns of our ancient hills. This is not just a story about missing children. This is a warning about what still lurks beneath our feet, waiting for the right moment to claim the next generation. And after 3 decades of silence, that moment has arrived. Millbrook, West Virginia, population 847, sits nestled in a valley surrounded by some of the oldest mountains in North America. Our town has existed since 1889, built around coal mining and timber harvesting. For over a century, we lived peacefully among these ancient peaks, unaware that we had disturbed something that had been sleeping for millennia. The disappearances began in September 1992 with 8-year-old Sarah Chun. She vanished while walking the 50 yards from her school bus to her front door. Her backpack was found 3 days later, hanging from a tree branch 20 feet above ground level. No ladder, no climbing equipment, no explanation for how it got there. 3 months later, 11-year-old Marcus Webb disappeared from his own bedroom. His parents heard him talking to someone through his closed door at midnight. When they checked on him an hour later, Marcus was gone. His second-story window was open, but there were no footprints in the fresh snow below, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate how a child could have vanished from a locked room. By 1995, 14 children had disappeared. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. The FBI established a task force, convinced we were dealing with a sophisticated kidnapping ring or serial killer. They interviewed hundreds of residents, searched thousands of acres of wilderness, and found absolutely nothing. The pattern became clear over the years. Children between ages 8 and 12 would vanish during routine activities, walking to school, playing in their backyards, sleeping in their beds. No ransom demands ever came. No bodies were ever recovered. It was as if these children simply ceased to exist. But there were signs that we collectively chose to ignore. In the weeks before each disappearance, the targeted child would exhibit strange behavioral changes. They would draw disturbing pictures of underground tunnels and shadowy figures. They would speak about hearing voices calling their names from a forest. They would wake up screaming about dreams where they were being pulled deep into the earth. The most disturbing pattern was the timing. The disappearances always occurred during the new moon, when the darkness was absolute in our mountain valley. And they always happened in clusters. 3 to 5 children would vanish within days of each other, then nothing for months or sometimes years. By 2010, 46 children had disappeared from Millbrook. The town's population had dwindled as families moved away, terrified that their children would be next. Those who remained installed security systems, implemented buddy systems, and never let their children out of sight after dark. But none of it mattered. The entity that had awakened beneath our mountains could not be stopped by human precautions. It had been hunting long before our town existed, and it would continue hunting long after we were all gone. I know this because on October 13th, 1994, I came face to face with the thing that had been taking our children. And what I discovered in those underground chambers changed my understanding of reality forever. October 13th, 1994. I remember every detail of that night with crystalline clarity, despite spending the last 30 years trying to forget. I was 10 years old, staying overnight at my best friend Danny Morrison's house. Danny would become victim number 19 just 6 hours after I escaped. The Morrison family lived in a modest two-story house at the edge of town, where the suburban streets gave way to dense Appalachian forest. Danny's bedroom faced the woods, and we often fell asleep listening to the sounds of nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush. That night was different. The forest was completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves despite the October wind. Even more unsettling was the absence of the Morrison family dog, Rex, who always barked at every sound after midnight. Rex had been whimpering in the basement since sunset, refusing to come upstairs no matter how much we called him. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of Danny talking to someone. His voice was dreamy, distant, as if he were speaking in his sleep, but his eyes were open, staring out the bedroom window toward the tree line. "Yes, I can hear you," Danny whispered. "I'm coming." I sat up in my sleeping bag and looked out the window. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The trees at the edge of the property were moving, but not from wind. They were bending inward, creating a tunnel-like pathway that led deeper into the forest. "Danny, what are you doing?" I whispered. He didn't respond. He was already climbing out of bed, walking toward the window with mechanical, puppet-like movements. His face was blank, expressionless, as if something else was controlling his body. I tried to grab his arm, but my hand passed right through him. Danny wasn't fully there anymore. He was becoming translucent, fading like morning mist. I watched in horror as he walked through the closed window, as if it were made of air. That's when I heard my name being called from the forest. "Thomas, Thomas, come play with us, Thomas." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing inside my skull rather than through my ears. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey. I found myself walking toward the window, my mind foggy and detached from my body. But as my hand touched the glass, something jolted me back to consciousness. A sharp pain shot through my left wrist, where I wore a silver bracelet that had belonged to my deceased grandmother. The bracelet was burning against my skin, and the pain broke whatever spell had been cast over me. Suddenly I could think clearly again. I could see Danny's translucent form floating through the trees, moving towards something massive and dark that waited in the depths of the forest. What happened next defies all logic and reason, but I swear on my life that every word is true. What do you think about what you've witnessed so far? Do you believe that some places on Earth harbor ancient evils that predate human civilization? Have you ever experienced something supernatural that changed your worldview forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because what you're about to hear in the next chapter will challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. The pain from my grandmother's silver bracelet kept me conscious and in control of my own body. But it didn't stop the overwhelming compulsion to follow Danny into the forest. Against every survival instinct, I climbed out the window and began walking toward the trees. The moment my feet touched the forest floor, the world around me changed. The familiar woods of my childhood became an alien landscape of twisted branches and glowing fungi. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something ancient and predatory. The pathway through the trees led steadily downward, though I hadn't remembered any significant slope in that part of the forest. As I walked, I could see other children ahead of me, some I recognized from recent disappearances, others who seemed to have been walking this path for much longer. Their clothes were from different decades, different eras. Sarah Chun, who had vanished 2 years earlier, walked just ahead of me, but she had aged, or rather, changed. Her skin had a pale, luminescent quality, and her eyes reflected light like an animal's. When she turned to look at me, she smiled with too many teeth. "You're finally joining us, Tommy," she said in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "We've been waiting so long." The path led to a circular clearing I had never seen before, despite having explored these woods my entire life. In the center of the clearing was a hole in the ground, so perfectly round it looked artificial. The hole was perhaps 10 feet in diameter, and from its depths came a soft, pulsing light that seemed to call to something primal in my brain. Danny and the other children were walking single file toward the hole. As each child reached the edge, they simply stepped forward and disappeared into the depths without hesitation or fear. When it was Danny's turn, he paused for just a moment and looked back at me. "It's wonderful down there, Tommy," he said with genuine happiness in his voice. "You don't have to be scared anymore. You don't have to worry about anything. Just let go." Then he stepped into the hole and vanished. The compulsion to follow was overwhelming. But my grandmother's bracelet continued to burn against my skin, keeping a small part of my mind free from whatever influence controlled the others. Instead of walking forward, I found myself crouching behind a large boulder at the edge of clearing. What emerged from the hole next will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was massive, easily 15 feet tall, but its exact shape seemed to shift and blur as I looked at it. Sometimes it appeared vaguely humanoid, with elongated limbs and a head that was too large for its body. Other times it looked more like a tree made of shadow and bone, with branches that move like arms and roots that writhe like tentacles. But its eyes were always constant. 2 points of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When those eyes turned in my direction, I felt a pressure in my mind like nothing I had ever experienced. It was trying to reach into my thoughts, to take control of my will the way it had controlled the other children. The bracelet burned hotter, and I bit down on my tongue hard enough to draw blood. The physical pain helped me resist the mental invasion. Through sheer force of will, I managed to remain hidden behind the boulder. What I witnessed next revealed the true horror of what had been happening to Millbrook's children. The entity began to change them. The children who had disappeared over the years weren't dead. They were being transformed into something else. I watched as their human features gradually shifted, becoming more angular, more predatory. Their skin took on that same luminescent quality I had noticed in Sarah, and their eyes began to reflect light like nocturnal hunters. They were becoming extensions of the entity itself, scouts and gatherers who could move through our world undetected. I realized with growing horror that some of them had been returning to town, living among us while they selected the next victims for their master. But the most terrifying revelation came when I recognized some of the transformed children. They weren't just from recent disappearances. Some had been missing for decades. I saw clothes and hairstyles from the 1970s, the 1960s, even earlier. This entity had been hunting in our mountain for generations, possibly centuries. The ritual continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it was complete, the entity and its transformed children retreated back into the depths of the hole. The clearing became silent and dark, the unnatural light fading to black. I remained hidden behind that boulder until sunrise, terrified to move. When the first rays of dawn touched the clearing, everything changed back to normal. The hole in the ground was gone, replaced by ordinary forest floor covered in fallen leaves. The twisted trees straightened, the glowing fungi disappeared, and the overwhelming sense of ancient evil faded like a bad dream. But I knew it hadn't been a dream. My grandmother's bracelet had left a permanent burn mark on my wrist that remains visible to this day. And when I finally made my way back to the Morrison house, I found Danny's parents calling the police to report their son missing. Thank you so much for staying with this story so far. I truly appreciate your time and attention, and I promise you that the most shocking revelations are yet to come. What you're about to discover will explain not only how I survived, but why the disappearances stopped for nearly 2 decades, and why they've started again. After that night in October 1994, I became a different person. The trauma of witnessing Danny's transformation and barely escaping the same fate changed me in ways that took years to understand. But more importantly, it opened my eyes to signs that our community had been willfully ignoring for generations. I started researching the history of Millbrook and the surrounding Appalachian region. What I discovered in dusty newspaper archives and forgotten historical records painted a picture that made my blood run cold. The disappearances hadn't started in 1992. They had been happening cyclically for over a century, but previous generations had found ways to explain them away or cover them up entirely. Children who vanished in the 1950s were written off as runaways. Those who disappeared in the 1920s were blamed on wild animals or mining accidents. But the pattern was always the same. Clusters of children between ages 8 and 12, vanishing during new moons, exhibiting strange behaviors beforehand. The only difference was that by the 1990s, modern communication and media attention made it impossible to hide what was happening. I also discovered something even more disturbing. Some families in Millbrook knew about the entity. They had known for generations. The coal mining operation that founded our town in 1889 had been forced to abandon several deep shafts after workers reported unnatural occurrences in the tunnels. The official record cited structural instability, but personal journals and letters I found in the Historical Society told a different story. Miners wrote about hearing children's voices echoing from unexplored depths. They described finding primitive drawings on tunnel walls that seemed to move and change when viewed by lamplight. Most disturbingly, they reported that some of their colleagues began exhibiting the same blank, controlled behavior I had witnessed in Danny. The mining operation shut down in 1923 after 17 workers vanished overnight. The official explanation was a cave-in, but no bodies were ever recovered, and there was no evidence of structural collapse. The mine entrances were sealed with concrete and steel, but I suspected that hadn't been enough to contain what lived beneath our mountains. As I dug deeper into Millbrook's history, I began to notice patterns in how certain families had survived while others lost children. The families who never experienced disappearances were always the oldest in the community, those whose ancestors had been present during the original mining operations. These families possessed knowledge that they guarded jealously. They knew when to keep their children indoors. They knew which parts of the forest to avoid. Most importantly, they knew how to recognize when the entity was stirring and preparing to hunt. I realized that my own family had been among the unknowing. We were relative newcomers to Millbrook, having moved there in 1987. We had no ancestral knowledge to protect us, no understanding of the ancient compact that kept some families safe while sacrificing others. But why had my grandmother's silver bracelet saved me when it couldn't save Danny or the other children? The answer came from an unexpected source. In 1999, 5 years after my encounter, I was approached by Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman whose family had been in Millbrook since its founding. She was 93 years old and dying of cancer, and she said she needed to clear her conscience before passing on. Eleanor told me about the compact, an agreement made between the founding families and the entity in 1889. In exchange for being allowed to settle in the valley, the families would provide regular offerings to keep the entity satisfied and dormant. These offerings were always children from newcomer families, those who had no knowledge of the agreement and no protection against what lived beneath the mountains. The system worked for over a century. The entity would remain dormant for years or even decades, then wake periodically to claim its due. The founding families would subtly guide it toward specific targets. Children whose disappearances could be explained away or covered up. But something changed in the 1990s. The entity's hunger had grown stronger and began taking children more frequently than the compact allowed. Worse, it was starting to transform its victims instead of simply consuming them, creating an army of altered children who could operate in the human world. Eleanor explained that my grandmother's bracelet contained silver that had been blessed by a Cherokee shaman in the 1800s, before the area was settled by Europeans. The Native Americans had known about the entity for centuries and had developed protections against it. My grandmother had purchased the bracelet from a Cherokee trader without knowing its true significance. That blessed silver had been the only thing standing between me and the same fate that befell 96 other children. But Eleanor's most terrifying revelation was yet to come. She told me that the compact was breaking down. The founding families were dying off or moving away, taking their knowledge with them. Worse, the entity was growing stronger with each feeding, and its transformed servants were becoming more numerous and more sophisticated in their hunting methods. The disappearances had stopped in 2007 not because the entity had been defeated, but because it had entered a period of dormancy to digest and process the children it had collected over 15 years. Eleanor estimated that this dormancy period would last approximately 15 to 20 years. When it wakes up again, she warned me, it will be hungrier than ever, and there will be no one left who remembers how to appease it. Eleanor Whitman died 3 weeks after our conversation. She was the last surviving member of the original founding families. And with her death, the ancient knowledge that had protected Millbrook for over a century was lost forever. I thought I had 15 to 20 years to figure out how to stop what was coming. I was wrong. The disappearances resumed in 2019, and they're happening faster than ever before. I left Millbrook in 2001, the day after I graduated from high school. I couldn't bear to stay in a place where I knew children were being systematically sacrificed to feed an ancient horror. I moved to Denver, changed my name, and tried to build a normal life far from the mountains of West Virginia. For 18 years, I almost succeeded. I got married, started a career in software development, and convinced myself that what I had experienced was a childhood trauma blown out of proportion by an overactive imagination. I told myself that the disappearances had stopped because the real perpetrator, some human monster, had finally been caught or had died. But the nightmares never stopped. Every new moon, I would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing voices calling my name from non-existent forests. My wife, Sarah, learned not to ask about the burn scar on my wrist or why I insisted on keeping lights on throughout our house after dark. Then, in March 2019, I received a phone call that shattered my carefully constructed new reality. The caller identified himself as Detective Mike Rodriguez with the West Virginia State Police. 3 children had disappeared from Millbrook in the span of 1 week. Emma Chun, Sarah's younger sister, Marcus Jr., the son of one of my childhood friends, and a new resident named Jamie Peterson. Mr. Mitchell, Detective Rodriguez said, I understand you were a childhood friend of some previous disappearance victims. We're reopening all the cold cases and would appreciate any information you might have. I hung up without responding, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. The entity was active again, and just as Eleanor Whitman had predicted, it was hungrier than ever. 3 children in 1 week was unprecedented. Even during the worst periods of the 1990s and 2000s, the disappearances had been spaced out over months. Over the following weeks, I compulsively searched online news sources for updates from Millbrook. The reports were terrifying in their familiarity. Children exhibiting strange behavioral changes in the weeks before they vanished. Drawings of underground tunnels and shadowy figures. Reports of voices calling from the forest during new moons. But there were new elements that hadn't been present during my childhood. Witnesses reported seeing some of the missing children after they had officially disappeared. Emma Chin had been spotted by 3 different people walking through downtown Millbrook at night. But when approached, she would vanish into shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide in. These sightings confirmed my worst fears. The entity wasn't just taking children anymore. It was using its transformed servants to actively hunt new victims. The missing children from the 1990s and 2000s, now grown to adult size, but retaining their altered appearance, were returning to collect the next generation. The final catalyst came in August 2022. I received a package with no return address, containing a single photograph. It showed Danny Morrison, recognizable despite 30 years of transformation, standing outside an elementary school in Millbrook. He looked exactly as he had at age 10, but his skin had that same luminescent quality I remember from the forest clearing, and his eyes reflected the camera flash like an animal's. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "We haven't forgotten about you, Tommy. Come home." I knew then that my decades of hiding were over. The entity and its servants remembered that I had escaped, and they want to complete what they had started in 1994. More importantly, they were using their knowledge of the town and its residents to hunt more efficiently than ever before. I tried to warn the authorities, but how do you explain to rational people that an ancient underground entity is using transformed children to hunt new victims? My calls to the FBI and state police were politely dismissed. My attempts to contact current Millbrook residents through social media were ignored or blocked. That's when I realized that some of the current residents might already be compromised. If the entity's servants could pass for human in casual encounters, they could have infiltrated the community completely. The children who had disappeared in recent years might be walking among the remaining families, selecting targets for their master. In October 2022, exactly 28 years after my original encounter, I made the decision to return to Millbrook, not to hide or run away this time, but to find a way to stop what had been happening for over a century. I arrived to find a town that was barely surviving. The population had dropped to fewer than 200 people, mostly elderly residents who couldn't afford to move away, and young families who had no idea what they were walking into. Main Street was lined with empty storefronts, and the few businesses that remained open seemed to be struggling. But the most disturbing change was the children. In a town of 200 people, there should have been dozens of school-age kids. Instead, I saw maybe 8 or 9, and they all exhibited the same strange characteristics I remember from my childhood encounters with the entity's influence. They moved with that same puppet-like coordination I had seen in Danny. They spoke in whispers and seemed to watch everything with predatory intensity. Most unsettling of all, they all wore similar clothing, dark pants and hoodies that seemed designed to help them blend into shadows. I realized that the entity had achieved something it had never managed during my childhood. It had effectively taken control of Millbrook itself. The few remaining children were either already transformed or being prepared for transformation. The adults were either servants of the entity or unconscious collaborators who had been manipulated into enabling the hunting process. But I had returned with advantages I hadn't possessed as a 10-year-old child. I had decades of research into the entity's history and behavior patterns. I had my grandmother's silver bracelet, now supplemented with additional blessed silver items I had acquired over the years. Most importantly, I had adult knowledge and resources that might allow me to do what previous generations have been unable or unwilling to accomplish. I'm not here to hide anymore. I'm here to end this, even if it costs me my life, because I've realized that the entity's influence is spreading beyond Millbrook. There have been similar disappearances reported in other Appalachian communities, all following the same pattern I know so well. If I don't stop it here, in the place where it first awakened in the modern era, it will continue spreading until every mountain community in the region becomes a feeding ground for ancient horror. The children of Millbrook are counting on me, even if they don't know it yet. And somewhere beneath these ancient mountains, 96 transformed souls are waiting to see if their one-time companion will finally join them, or he'll find a way to set them free. This is my story, and it's far from over. As I speak these words, I'm sitting in a motel room on the outskirts of Millbrook, preparing for what may be my final confrontation with the entity that has haunted this community for over a century. Tomorrow night is the new moon, and I know it will try to claim more children if I don't act. I want you to understand that I'm not sharing this story for sympathy or attention. I'm sharing it because people need to know what's really happening in small communities throughout Appalachia. The disappearances, the cover-ups, the ancient evils that still lurk in places where modern civilization fears to tread. If something happens to me, if I become the 98th victim instead of the sole survivor, this record will serve as evidence of what really happened in Millbrook, West Virginia. More importantly, it will serve as a warning to other communities that might face similar threats. But I also want to know what you think. Have you ever heard of similar disappearances in your area? Do you believe that some places on Earth harbor forces that predate human understanding? Have you ever experienced something that defied rational explanation but felt absolutely real? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories might provide clues that could help other communities recognize and resist what I've been fighting for 30 years. If this story has affected you as deeply as it affected me to live through it, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We're committed to investigating and sharing stories about the unexplained phenomena that shape our world in ways most people never realize. And don't miss our next investigation, the Appalachian Forest Ranger who disappeared for 6 days. What he found changes everything. It's a story that connects directly to what happened in Millbrook, and it reveals that the entity I encountered may be just one of many ancient forces stirring throughout the Appalachian mountain range. The truth is out there, waiting in the shadows between what we know and what we're afraid to discover. The only question is whether we're brave enough to shine a light into those shadows, or whether we'll continue to let them consume the innocent while we look the other way.